Welcome to More Than a Conversation, the podcast where we meet and have discussions with some of the most interesting people and innovative leaders in their fields from all walks of life. We will be discussing everything from politics to theology to religion to philosophy to life. Every once in a while, I may just be on here talking about whatever's in the news and whatever I think will be of interest to you. This is your host, Patrick Connolly, and I hope that today will be more than a conversation for you. Welcome to More Than a Conversation. This is your host, Patrick Connolly, and today I am joined by somebody that I think you guys are going to love hearing from. There's so many lessons that you're going to learn during this time. You're going to want to go out and get a copy of his book when we're done talking to him. In fact, he's someone that as I read his book, I was calling other leaders in my life and saying, you've got to hear this. This guy is writing, and to use a pastoral term, in a prophetic sense to leaders somewhat in my own organization. That being said, let me take a moment and introduce you all to former Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Scheller, the author of Crisis of Command, which just came out a couple weeks ago, and you need to get a copy of. You can get it wherever books are sold. I've got it on Kindle myself. But Stu, thank you for joining us today.
Pat, thanks for having me on the show.
So I want to start, when I heard you, first time I'd ever heard your name, I'm listening to Jocko Willink's podcast, along with a few million other people. And I hear this guy on there telling the story. Now, I hadn't heard you tell your story. And then suddenly I made the connection back as you're telling your story. I go, wait a second, I've heard a little more about this guy. And so you made some waves a few years ago, or a year ago now, I guess, with a video that went all over the internet, said a lot of things that a lot of people were thinking. You are famous for that. That has led to this book. It's led to this conversation. It's led to you being on Fox News and Huckabee and all the other places I've seen you showing up. All those things have happened. It changed your life, but I want to start prior to that moment, if we can quickly. And on More Than a Conversation, we like to kind of do an origin story. So you are known to the world as this Lieutenant Colonel of the Marine Corps who went out and put it all on the line and changed his life to speak truth. But before that, who were you? Tell us a little bit about growing up and when your path started leading toward the Marines.
So I grew up as a normal white kid, German immigrant of like 3 generations ago in middle America. My dad was broke as a 24-year-old, had me at like 23. So mom and dad married real young, both poor out of Illinois. My dad got a job with Blue Cross and Blue Shield selling corporate insurance. And basically it became all in, was a good salesman. And we moved around the Midwest a lot. And so because my parents were moving and they were so young, they had a larger family. I guess it was probably more average back then. But so they had 4 children real young. So all 4 children before the age of 30, right? And we moved from 1st to 7th grade. I lived in St. Louis, Missouri. We actually had a farm and some horses and goats and chickens, but we didn't use the farm for sustenance. It was just kind of like a hobby. And my dad still worked in the corporate insurance world. And then, I hate horses today. I was cleaning horse pastures and weeding gardens my youth. Got into sports a lot. Moved to Cincinnati in 7th grade. Played baseball, basketball, soccer, cross country. But soccer is really where I excelled. And so that kind of became the full-time sport. Was a starter on my high school soccer team as a freshman. Made All-State out of Ohio. Got a full ride to a school in Eastern Kentucky called Cumberland College. Played 2 seasons there, transferred back to the University of Cincinnati, and got an accounting degree. I got an accounting degree because my grandfather, he was the only person that was in the military. I looked up to him a lot. He was in the beaches of Normandy as a soldier. And then he got out and got his accounting master's and went into the FBI. And so I got my accounting degree thinking I was going to go into the FBI. Back then, the FBI had a different reputation than it has today. When I graduated University of Cincinnati, moved out to Virginia with $8,000 in a bank account, put a down payment on a house. My dad co-signed on a mortgage because I didn't have any credit back then. met a girl, and then I was discontent with my life. I was bored. I didn't want to be an accountant. I was a 23-year-old dude that was looking for adventure. I longed for the feeling of being on a team because I grew up in sports. And since I moved away, I'd kind of isolated myself with my girlfriend, was just out there going 9 to 5, working accounting. And that was 2004 when the war was hot and heavy in Fallujah. I was watching the war. And I realized that, not often is there a war as heavy as it was at that time, right in a time where I was capable of serving. So I decided I wanted to experience that. I wanted to help make America a better place for our children. And I wanted to go and serve my country. So put in the application for the Marine Corps in the fall of '04. It was accepted. And by January '05, I was at boot camp. And then I went on and I served 17 years.
So when you were going in to the military and you're making that decision, what made you choose the Marine Corps?
I addressed in the book. I'm not sure. I can't place definitively why the Marines, because I really didn't have no one in my family was in the military except for my grandfather who was in the Army. But somewhere along the way, I just developed the perception that the Marines was one of the best. I had a high school soccer coach when I was started on my freshman year, and all the way through my high school career. He was a Marine major, had a lot of stories being combat. He told me I'd be a great Marine officer. But other than that, I had a lot of friends over in the Marines. And when I was watching the war unfold in '04 in the fall in Fallujah, it was actually the Marines that were on the TV screens. And it just spoke to me. And that was the first recruiter I went to. And I just stuck with it. And that's where I ended up.
Yeah, I noticed that in the book you said they tried to convince you to be a pilot, and you said, "No, I want to be on the ground and leading a team." As you're going into your career, you're starting a little bit later, having already gone through college, but that allowed you to go to officer candidate school. At that time, it seems like though pretty early on, you started recognizing in the people that were training you that maybe the Marines had a way of thinking that just didn't seem to make sense, even in regarding in the people they chose to train you. What were some of the first things you noticed even walking in the door?
Yeah, great question. So I was so ignorant. I didn't even know that they were going to yell at us at boot camp. I don't know what I was thinking. I just assumed it would be, because it was officer candidate school, big boy rules, right? Here's the challenge. Go complete the challenge. If you don't complete it, you don't make the team. Stuff like that, right? Like, I still knew they were cutting people and it was going to be very difficult, but I didn't think it was going to be like this 5 people screaming while spitting on your face, screaming, type deal. And that was the rude awakening I had, is that's what it was. It was drill instructors screaming up in your face. And it seemed to be more small little things, a test of resiliency, more than me demonstrating critical thinking and leading a team and overcoming challenges. And so I was surprised by that right out of the gate.
Was that a precursor to the idea that maybe ancillary issues would be bigger than leadership later down the road?
It absolutely was. And quite honestly, in the current system, it actually is a great model, because in the current system, your ability to critically think and diverge from the way is not really celebrated. And just take it and remain quiet is actually what's going to make you successful. So in many ways, the way they do it is conducive to the system. But what I'm arguing is the system doesn't do it well. You just being resilient is not enough. Your ability to think deeply and know when to break the rules and to do things different at times is very important. And that's just not something that they put an emphasis on.
So you're in a training routine, and as you're in this routine, there's one guy leading, then the next guy leads the next section, the next guy leads the next section, and it comes time for you to lead. And when it comes time for you to lead, your scenario is you lead the guys down a hill. The next hill, there is a dug-in machine gun. I don't know the details of what they escape me in the moment, but there's this machine gun that's got the high ground, that's dug in. You guys are assaulting with M16s, I believe is what you said in the book. And so you're outgunned. They've got the ground. They've got everything to their advantage. And so you decide that you're not going to just run directly up this hill and lead your men into certain death. What was your decision at that point?
Yeah, great question. I'm digging this. I haven't got a chance to talk about some of these things. So, the event at Officer Candidate School, mostly it's just rogue memorization and getting yelled at, but they do two events that they call the Squad Unit Leadership Evaluation, SULE. So, they call it a SULE. So, it's SULE 1 and SULE 2. And I remember as a student on one of my SULEs, and so it's like a 12-mile run. You got 12 people in your squad, and every mile, they rotate a leader. There's a captain that runs with you the 12 miles, and that each mile that you're in charge gives him an opportunity to evaluate your leadership. And then there's different challenges that you have to overcome at those mile markers, which is essentially what I'm advocating for. So like the two SULEs are literally what I thought the 10 weeks of Officer Candidate School would be, but really it just comes down to those two events in a lot of ways. And so on one of these events, it was my turn to be in charge. And you get to the station. I've got my 11 peers and then the captain outlining the problem. And yeah, our weapons were M16s. We didn't have ammo. It was a training event. So you have BFAs and blank rounds. And he says, all right, you're located here. There's a suspected enemy in this location. Your mission is to go destroy that enemy. Go, right? So you get your guys, you know where the direction of the enemy is. And I get them in an appropriate tactical formation, and in the terrain is a steep drop. So there's no way around it. We got to go down this drop. As we start going down the drop at the top, so then the train goes back up. At the top of the next hill was, other Marines pretending to meet enemy instructors, and they had a machine gun that also had blanks, right? And so it starts opening up at us. So the situation was, we were in the low ground. The machine gun was on the high ground. It was shooting at us, and I knew that what they wanted was a leader to demonstrate, the fighter leader, aggressive, follow me, let's charge the machine gun bunker.
Chesty Puller.
What's up?
He's like Chesty Puller, right? Just
right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what they wanted. And it was pretty clear, like the way they had set up the scenario. But to me, like there was other ways to envelop that machine gun rather than just running at the machine gun fire. And so I just started, I looked at all our guys. We were in the low ground. We had weapons, and we hadn't actually made it all the way to the low ground. So imagine, you're 2/3 of the way down. So we still had another 100 meters to go down and then another 300 meters up. Rather than do that, I decided to try to pull them back over the high ground, gather whoever hadn't been shot, and figure out a different plan. And so really what it came down to was, in the moment, the one split second I had to evaluate it, I just started screaming, retreat, retreat, follow me. And I started running in the opposite direction, back over the high ground, right? So I get all my guys back up. Obviously, no one really got shot because it was blanks. So they all get back up there. We moved so quickly, the instructors didn't have time to assess casualties. And so then I start evaluating how I'm going to envelop them. And then they basically stopped the scenario. And that was it. So I didn't get an opportunity to flank or do anything differently. And the captain looked at me and said, hey, you had great command presence. You made a decision very quickly. You evaluated the situation very quickly. But you yelled retreat. Marine officers never retreat. And I looked at him and I was like, sir, we had M16s. We were moving down into the low ground, and then we had to come up the high ground. We would have all died. I think I made the right decision. And he just looked right back at me and said, Marine officers never retreat. At that point, as a candidate, you just say, yes, sir, aye, sir. Right. And that's what I said. But I put it in the book because I gave the caveat that captain, I went back and taught at that school. I was that captain 4 years later, 5 years later. And that captain was probably not an infantry guy. Like, let's assume he's a supply officer, right? He doesn't have probably a tactical background. But what he was offering me was the insight of the culture of the Marine Corps. And there was a prevalent attitude like that. And that's why I put it in the book, because there's often this no, you got to be strong. You got to go do this. It's got to be hard. You got to be resilient. And it's like, but that's not the most effective way. It's like, well, it doesn't matter, and so that's why I put that little story in there.
Next time you try that, advance this way, right? That's, but so quickly, you start recognizing that things are going to be different, but you made it through. You go through officer candidate school. You start moving into, I guess, what would become your first command. At that point, you're going to be a platoon commander. Is that where that begins?
That's right. Yeah. So I got through, after OCS, the basic school infantry officer course is about an aggregate of a year of school. And once I got out of infantry officer course, they assigned me to my first unit was 1-8 in Camp Lejeune, and I was assigned as a platoon commander.
And so you show up, but on your way there, you're going to be a platoon commander, but you got to learn a few more things about culture. One of those things is you've just come through training and you guys were promised some break, right? You're promised like 30 days, get some time away. And then it seems like you had a commander, though, your boss, who basically tells you that is what you're owed, but no one had better take it. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So when I graduated infantry officer course, you got to keep in mind that this is like December 2005. The war is hot and heavy right now. It's probably the worst time in the Iraq war was into 2005, all of 2006, right? That was when it was at its peak of just violent, things were kind of falling apart. It was not stable. And so they wanted us young lieutenants badly. And so my battalion XO drove up. It was me and probably like 8 other guys. So 1-8 was getting like 9 of us. It was a huge dump of lieutenants for this unit to make them healthy, to get them ready to deploy. And so he pulled all of us in a room and he congratulated us for getting through, told us how excited he was to get us. And then he ultimately threatened us and said exactly that. The order says you get 30 days, but if any of you take 30 days, you're not going to be a platoon commander on the next deployment. I'm going to make you work in the staff. He's like, I need you out down there by next week. And so, I put that story in there because that's just kind of how it works sometimes. Like, no matter what the rules say, you're going to have leaders that if they want to apply pressure and you're at a weakened position, what's a second lieutenant going to do and say, no, I'm going to take my 30 days because that's what the right thing to do. Like, no, you're going to do what the leader in that organization is telling you to do because you want to be a platoon commander. I mean, that's why you just spent a year in training. And so, we drove down and checked in the next week.
And so at that point, what are you thinking when he tells you, no, you're not going back? You got to go. Are you thinking, hey, we're at this spot where it's just time for me to do my job? Or are you thinking, I don't know about the way these guys run things?
No, at that time I was still just, gung-ho motivated. I wanted to get to the fight. And so it didn't matter to me. At that point in my career, I just said, okay, well, I'll see you next week.
And you're obviously you're buying in. And I want to paint the picture for everyone that's out there before we get into the next part of this. It's important for them, I think, to understand that you are, in a lot of ways, you represent maybe a more moderate America, if I can put it that way, in that you don't come from this background of, the whole family's in the military, you're arguing over if it's hoorah or oorah, you don't have that. And like, you don't have this over the top desire to be in the military. Then you feel the call, like it's really the perfect story, middle America, in the Midwest, whatever, just living life, feel like I want to do more. I've been to college, therefore I'm going to go be an officer. The perfect thing for an officer. Then you get there and you're not a guy who is like a rebel from the moment you get there. You weren't even expecting it. Now, at some point you go, dude, get on YouTube and watch, I guess 04, but you get on YouTube and watch a video of what it looks like when you get there. But you get there and you talk about you're not prepared, even like a lot of these kids where they had somebody in their ear saying, hey, put all your stuff in a Ziploc bag so you're not the last guy out of the room, like you got to experience the fun of being. And so all of those things are going on, but you bought into it. And this next thing I want to ask you about is something it shows that you bought in. You were a guy who was going to follow the system, and that is you stand up and it's time for you to address, I guess, your first group of Marines. And as you stand up to address them, you happen to notice something about their uniforms. Tell us about what you noticed and then how that story kind of worked out.
Yeah, great setup. So I say in the book, there's some things you just never forget. And meeting my first platoon is something I'll never forget. It was also kind of surreal because the unit that I had watched on TV surrounding Fallujah was 1-8. 1-8 was actually like this, like if you were to take an arrow that pushed through the city, they were literally the center point of that kinetic fight, right? So they were in the very center of the push, and they lost a lot of guys, and they saw a lot of combat. And so when I showed up to them, we knew we were out the door in 6 months. So it wasn't like I was going to get years with training with this unit. I knew after showing up, this group of war veterans, I only had 6 months until we might be right back in the middle of that war, right? And so I'm talking to them and I'm telling them stuff that I had heard through the schoolhouse, that I was going to be a fighter leader and that I was going to work for them and I was going to train them hard. But I'd always, lead from the front. And then that's really all I say. And I'm studying them, they're studying me. And then I leave the conversation. I take my platoon sergeant. And the thing that struck me when I was talking to them is half of them were in sweats, which I was always told in the schoolhouse, everyone would have their appropriate uniform. The platoon sergeant would make sure of that. And that's the platoon sergeant's responsibilities, all this discipline. And so that's why I didn't say anything to them. And I pulled my platoon sergeant aside. I was like, hey, man, what's the deal? You can't get the platoon in the correct uniform when they're talking to the platoon commander for the first time. And he just kind of laid into me, rightfully so, and made me feel real sheepish because he said, hey, sir, they all have that half of the platoon that you saw in sweats have doctor's notes because they still have shrapnel in their body and they can't wear restrictive apparel for wearing their camis. And then he kind of just got that in and stared at me for a second and then just kind of walked away. And, and I'm left just feeling like, man, this is real. There's a lot I have to learn and I need to be very humble here. There's a huge responsibility in front of me.
Walking into this thing, suddenly everything's real. All right, you got people. These are really like guys who have been in a real fight. At this point, obviously, you haven't been yet. So what are you thinking mentally when it hits you? Man, this is really real. There's really lives on the line. What kind of thoughts are going through your mind at that point?
At that point, I was just defaulting to what I knew, which was the Marine Corps does a very good job of making you a tactical expert on the current TTPs and weapon systems. So even though they had combat experience, I had training on the weapon systems and employment that they did not. And so my goal was to put them through a tough training cycle and make sure that they were as capable for the first deployment as I could make them. Now, was it challenging to have Lance corporals that had killed multiple people and seen their friends die and had been in these situations and then try to teach them how to do urban terrain? Yeah, absolutely. That's challenging, right? But at the same time, it was pounded into me that when the guns start firing, they're going to look to you. And so you have to be in charge. And so I just tried to train them as hard as I could.
So here you are, you come in, you have now been a Marine for how long at this point in the story?
When I first showed up, it was from OCS to showing up to 1A. It was only 11 months.
So you've been a Marine less than a year. Now you have guys who you're going to lead into combat. Then within a year, you're deployed into combat. Is that right?
Well, so we deployed. So I got there in December 2005, and we deployed in June 2006. So, 6.5-ish months. And we thought we were going to Iraq, but that's when Lebanon and Israel got into a conflict. So, I guess it was a combat zone. I didn't kill anyone. We didn't kill anyone. And then we sent snipers into Iraq after the boats sailed back. But that first deployment was not a combat deployment for me, from my perspective.
Gotcha. And so now, how much did you spend much time in combat zones or in combat leading men?
Yeah, I think Ramadi was definitely a combat zone. But I was a company executive officer at that point, so that was my second deployment. But that was still relatively quick. We deployed September 2007. So do the math. I left the schoolhouse in December 2005. So there's a year and a half. And then Afghanistan was very much combat for 365 days. But yeah, so.
Yeah. And so here you are, you're a guy you're an accountant 1 minute, and a couple years later, you're leading people in what may be the crucible of all crucibles, combat. What a radical change. And you're also leading people who are also people who came out of normal walks of life. And here you are. And of course, you mentioned Ramadi. Ramadi was a hotspot, often a place of legend, if you will. Then Afghanistan, all the combat going on there. A lot of those things happening. Tell me, if you will, you mentioned Afghanistan, and that's where this story really begins to make the shift. It feels like you had a connection with Afghanistan. Correct me if I'm wrong. You were there more than you were anywhere else. Is that correct as far as deployment?
Afghanistan was unique for me because I wasn't with the Marines. I was an individual. So, you're drinking less of the Kool-Aid because you're observing the problems almost on an island in a lot of ways. And so I was there for a year while different Army units came and left. And I was still there watching. And it was just a different experience.
And so how did you wind up being there, quote unquote, as an individual?
The military after Vietnam created the Joint Force, and the Joint Force now has something called a Joint Manning Document. And so essentially the joint world, which it means all services will throw people at the whatever the thing is, they have a Joint Manning Document, and the Marine Corps agreed to pay the tax of a infantry officer to support the counter IED mission. And when I wanted to get into Afghanistan, that was the opportunity I had, and so I took it.
So here you are, you've kind of, and I remember hearing you go through this with Jocko, and of course, both of you guys having that military background, able to really understand one another a lot more so in lingo. For the sake of an audience that's not as military minded, it's safe to say that you got to see a lot in a relatively fast period of time. You got to encounter a lot, and also you got to go through all the trainings. You got to go through all the spots, the positions. You got to lead small groups of people. You got to lead larger groups of people. You got a pretty good perspective of what the Marine life is like, and what combat is like, and what the theaters of war are like, were like at that moment for the United States. Is it pretty safe to say that you had a pretty good view of all those things, as good of a view as a Marine officer is going to get?
Yeah, I think so. And I think what was really nice about it is when I got those views, like between first lieutenant and young captain, it was one of those unique perspectives, which I was still very much on the tactical level with the junior people, but I was high enough in rank to be in the conversations of the lieutenant colonel, colonel general level. And so I really was at a sweet spot where, because I was low enough rank, I could go outside the wire every single day with the lance corporals, but I was still sitting in the meetings with the generals, right? So a very unique time in my career where I got to see really the whole breadth and width of it.
And then there were some, things that you started to notice. And before we talk about that actual high moment, if you will, the culmination of all these things, you just mentioned tactics. In the book, you say we win all the tactical battles, yet when it is time to link our tactical success to operational and strategic goals, the United States consistently fails. Now, that's a heavy sentence, and that's a heavy sentence coming from a Marine officer. That's a heavy sentence for most of us to read. We don't like to think of the United States having failed, yet in reality, and you point out the timeline after World War II, it does seem like there haven't been those blanket successes. So the difference between tactics versus operational and strategic goals, can you lay that out and then tell us why we find ourselves, where's the disconnect between tactics and operational success?
Yeah, great question. So in the military, the operational level is really the 4-star combatant command level up through the National Security Council. Like that's theoretically the operational level. Operational level is just a word. It's a mental model. I mean, all these things are not real. They're a mental construct that if they're helpful, you can use them. Strategic level would be the president's national security strategy, right? That's the strategy, the political objective of whatever the military campaign is. So how do you take those political objectives and achieve them with violence on the level of the platoon, right? And then somewhere in between that, you can say there's an operational level. If you were to really define that, it's probably the 4-star, because those are the senior military professionals in charge of taking those political objectives and turning them into campaign plans. So my point, and that's one of those, you said it was a heavy statement, a heavy sentence. That's one of those things where military academics could go through and probably find a million holes to it, right? Like you could argue the Desert Shield, Desert Storm, we achieved our objectives. But then I would say, we went right back there and allowed ourselves to get sucked into a loss. So like there's a lot of debating in there. But I made that sentence very deliberately because on the whole, it is true. I mean, it's true. And to your point, we don't want to discuss it because we don't want to think of ourselves as failures. But the truth is, we as the military professionals are not achieving what the politicians are outlining. And that's what it's all about, right? That's literally what it's all about. And so, that's I think if a politician outlines an objective, the 4-star general has a choice. They either resign and say, this is unachievable, you need to find somebody else, or they sit there and say, no, I'm the best person, I'll resign, but it's not going to change anything, so I'm going to stick with it. But then when they fail to achieve whatever it is, they should be held accountable. Now, the trick that they figured out that is if they do it for 20 years, it's hard to say that we failed after my 3-year tour as the combatant commander, right? So somebody needs to figure out measurable objectives for these guys in 3-year increments if we're going to go 20 years. Or you need to then go back after a 20-year campaign and say this whole thing failed. Hey, 4-star general, maybe you should only be getting 3-star general retirement pay or something like that. I mean, there's just really no culpability at this point.
And so what happens, it sounds like you're saying, is that because these guys are rotating through a conflict that is longer than any of their tenure in the conflict, everyone's responsible and no one's responsible.
Exactly right. The book reviews that I've gotten have said that. Well, why would we hold General McKenzie accountable? Because look at all the failures that are across the 20 years. And I just think that argument is so terrible because you're saying we shouldn't hold anyone accountable because everyone else wasn't held accountable. Like, we have to start somewhere.
Gotcha. And so it's also interesting because I think it's important for anyone in any organization to take this just out of the military context as well. You can have all the best tactics, whatever your organization is, they can send you to get the best training. You can have the best equipment. You can have all those things. But if somewhere there's not decision-making that is above you, that puts you in the right position to use those tactics, you're still going to see failure on a grand level. And I think people that are listening to this, you've seen it at your job. Maybe you work for a healthcare system and you're low level, not making decisions. You're just carrying out orders, but you can see the great failure that's happening there. And you've got the best tactics and training and the best degrees and all those things. And I think we can see that across board. So that's one of the things also that I think I would encourage folks to go out and get a copy of Crisis of Command, because this is a book that's going to open your eyes to a lot of things in the military. It's going to open your eyes to a lot of the situations that you need to know about regarding your nation, but it's also going to help you understand basic leadership in a much greater fashion than you already do. And I think that's a beautiful thing as well.
Hey, More Than a Conversation listeners, I hope that you are enjoying this conversation as much as I am, and I hope that you're getting something great out of it today. I'm just wanting to jump in here in the middle to take a moment and let you know a few ways that you can help out More Than a Conversation. First, wherever you're listening, please go ahead and click that subscribe button. That will definitely help, and that'll make sure that you get all the content. Also, if you have a way to rate, if your app allows you to give a 4-star, 5-star, whatever the rating is that's the top rating, I would so appreciate if you would go ahead and drop a rating there. That's how the aggregators and the distributors rank podcasts, and the higher the ranking you give, the more ears will be able to hear these great conversations. Thanks again, and I'm hoping that today has been more than a conversation for you. Now let's get back to it.
Now, you mentioned that somewhere in there, this operational level, you talked about these 4-star generals, and you've called some of them out by name. There's a few of them that you called out by name in the book, and I think I guess that's the valuable part of no longer being in the Marine Corps, is that now you can truly say, of course, no one's accusing you of not saying what you want to say at this point, but you got to say that. And one of the things, though, you mentioned these guys, but these are 4-star generals. So, I mean, these are 3-star generals. These are people who started out this path. They got the training, they got the tactics that you did. They're Americans. They're all the things that mean they should want the best. And my goodness, they got to the top. How did they get to the top? While, I don't know, it sounds like you're saying there might be some incompetence. If that's the case, how'd they get to the top?
Well, I think in all systems, it's not necessarily the best in terms of performance. It's the person that can navigate the system the best. So then you got to evaluate the system and say, how do you navigate it? And so, I mean, in politics, it's no different. Sometimes we get 2 political candidates running for president, and we're like, how are these the 2 choices that we have, right? It's not because those are the 2 best leaders in America. It's because those are the 2 people that can navigate politics in the most effective manner to get to the end of the race. And so for the military specifically, they're all great Americans, and all people that come in for the idealistic reasons to make America a better place. But what happens is, over a 40-year career, over time, the system is going to condition you based on whatever the system values as important. And in the military, it's all about pleasing your boss, defined by a subjective evaluation that boss gives you at each step of the job that you're doing. So if I'm a commander and I have 5 subordinates, I rank them 1 through 5 based on subjectively what I think the best person is. Now, sometimes that directly correlates to work performance and warfighting capability, but other times it relates to you talk back in meetings almost every time, and that bothers me. So even though you're the best performer, you're number 3 of 5, right? And so these people figure out over time, it's not necessarily about being the best at your job. It's about making sure the boss likes you the most. And so each time that's a little bit different based on the boss. And so what you get over 40 years is not the best warfighter. It's the best person willing to please their boss for 40 years, because that's what the system conditions. And so when we're looking for people to be courageous and push back on a boss, those are not the people.
And I notice you say this. You said military members receive favorable evaluations, which of course is how they get promoted, by reflecting the ideas and beliefs of their superiors. Okay, that makes sense, though. They're in the military. We want them to have the ideas and beliefs of the superiors. But then you said this. You said, as service members climb the career ladder, at each step of promotion, they become susceptible to veering away from a warfighting focus. So now I want to know, well, what are they focusing on? Because, and you didn't, the word because is my word, you say reflecting the status quo ideology of a boss is the easiest way to promotion. Currently, warfighting capability and winning wars are not priorities for promotion. Now that you've written that, published it, and you're sitting there and I'm asking you about it, you still stand by that statement?
Yeah, 100%. 100%.
And so this, how does an organization get to that point where moving up is more important than the actual mission that the organization exists for?
I mean, it's just the way the system is built. And I put in there's another part where it's like the foundational effectiveness of our military forefathers is rarely questioned in terms of like, how effective is it? I get this all the time. And it was the same thing about our questions about boot camp. People are like, well, it's been around for 200 years, so it must be effective. I'm like, no, just because it's existed for 200 years doesn't mean it's the most effective way to do it. Those are 2 different things, and you're confusing yourself. You know, just because the military system has always used the boss to subjectively evaluate you, that doesn't mean that's the most effective way to do it. And I mean, I feel like I lay out with a lot of evidence in the book that right now we need to reevaluate. I'm not saying my ideas are the best. Like, obviously I'm biased. I do think my ideas are the best, but I am smart enough to know there's a million other ways to solve the problem. But for us to not hard stop because we consistently are losing and reevaluate, I mean, even the core way we do things like boot camp, like the way we promote people is crazy to me.
What ways of promotion, when you say it's crazy the way we promote people, give me an example. Help me unpack that a little bit.
If I'm an infantry officer, the way I should get promoted is if I'm a platoon commander, you know, I get out of my training, right? And I show up to my unit. Those 6 months prior to my deployment, the way I got evaluated was my boss just ranking me amongst my peer platoon commanders. What should have happened is I take a platoon, my peer takes a platoon, you develop some scenario, and you figure out metrics for winner and loser, and we go against each other in a real performance scenario. That takes the boss's impression out of you completely. And so if you're an F-15 pilot, get in the simulator against this F-15 pilot, and we're going to develop a scenario. The best pilot gets promoted. And that we're just not doing it that way, and I don't understand why. In the business world, like they still have all this bureaucracy and all the same problems, but money is a way that is held accountable. If the corporation is not producing, ultimately the leadership is going to be held accountable because they have to make money. In the military, that's not the case. We're not holding them accountable. They're continuing to lose wars, and we're not changing out the leadership.
That sounds a lot like a meritocracy. I'm not sure that would be too popular in today's America. But so, you talk about the career roadmap. You talk about it being a thing for conformism. You've got to have somebody telling you how to navigate this. I've got a family member now that's in the military, and that's one of the things that I even tried to coach him on a little bit was, hey, you got to get somebody that can tell you how to navigate this thing, because you're going to be surrounded by people that know how to navigate it, and you're going to get left in their dust, even if you're better than them. Because we're trying to get people to walk down a particular path. And, you talk about that. You talk about the changes that need to be made. You also talk about pleasing superiors and being order followers. And you mentioned it a few minutes ago, and so I don't want to belabor the idea, but you talk about General McKenzie. You talk about when these orders are given. He's being questioned. He goes, "No, I'm just following orders." At what point is a senior leader or any leader responsible to say, "I just can't do it that way"?
I mean, if it's not the 4-star level, I don't know where it occurs. I mean, he could have done it with really no risk. He would have retired with his 4-star pension. Nothing would have changed other than he would have potentially been perceived as a courageous leader that was trying to stick up for America. But instead, he wanted to follow orders. And so, a lieutenant colonel that's 3 years short of retirement has everything to lose. But I was still willing to do it because I thought it was the right thing. So, I mean, if it's not at the 4-star level, then I don't know where it would happen.
And I think that is interesting, because one of the things that has kind of changed my perception. I had family who did the military route. Some of them, the picture behind me, my granddad, greatest generation, that's World War II, drafted, did those things. I think I've got the hat from my uncle in the Marines. That you have all of these things that develop your worldview. So I had these family members, and I've got this particular worldview, and I always thought of the military as being like the most pro-American institution that there was. It has to be. These people are willing to die for America. That's a pretty pro-American institution. What I have discovered, though, in over the last decade of my life is, which about the same decade as yours. I'm 36 now. So I've discovered that a lot of these senior leaders maybe aren't as ideological as I hoped they were, maybe aren't as into this thing called America, aren't as in love with that Constitution that they took an oath to. And I don't mean that to disparage any of them as individuals. I do think they all started at the same place, but somewhere along the line, maybe it's through the nepotism, maybe it's through everybody being pushed through the same scenarios, but they found themselves in very senior positions making decisions that absolutely make no sense. You mentioned Benghazi quickly in the book. You didn't spend a lot of time on it, but you did mention it. That's an example of something that you sit back and you go, wow, how did this happen? You talked about your own love for the military, or the idea of the military life, seeing Black Hawk Down. Black Hawk Down obviously being a perfect example of terrible leadership or terrible decisions being made going into that. I read some of the things that were surprising to me, I'll put it that way, in some of the books that I've read, even reading things like from Lone Survivor to what is it, American Sniper, those things. You read those books and you see maybe that the image or the togetherness isn't there like you thought it would be. I've read some of Mattis's stuff that he put out. And so I'm seeing this view that maybe has changed a little bit, my thoughts towards senior military leadership.
Well, what I'll offer you, of all the things that you just labeled off, oftentimes those things are backed and supported by the military. The military has figured out how to weaponize the media, and a lot of those things that you just talked about are literally military supported, a narrative that the military is pushing.
Yeah. And I think that's probably what's even makes it even more interesting, because I've got this idea that it's not what I thought it was, even while the military is, these things are vetted. So I'm wondering, well, what's an unvetted look, what's that look like? Which I guess now we have that as well. So
yeah, it's called crisis of command.
That's right. So we get to this decision that shocked the entire world. We got to a decision that my 7-year-old daughter would know better than making. And that is, we left Afghanistan. And correct me if I'm wrong. I'm going to give you my civilian view. You tell me, you were in the military at that time. But it appears to me that we left Afghanistan while, number one, projecting kind of when and how we were going to leave. Number two, giving up our most strategic air base that we had. And number three, we pulled out our military before we got our civilians and allies and friends out.
That's number four. Anyone that served there knows that the Taliban goes into the mountains of Pakistan in the winter. We did it during the peak fighting season for a PR date of September 11th, because that was more important than American lives and treasure. I mean, it couldn't have been a bigger list of just terrible decisions.
Yeah, and I forgot that one. I remember you mentioned that in the book. And so, yeah, so these guys are in the mountains. Why don't we leave when they're not out here, when these things can? We left thousands of prisoners to instantly swell the ranks of the Taliban the moment we left. All of these things happen. And I think, to me, the most common sense one is even like getting our people out before we withdraw the ability to defend them.
It seems so basic. It's embarrassing.
It is. It is absolutely one of the most embarrassing things that I've ever heard of in my life. It is one of the most, it turns out to be one of the most tragic decisions that was made in a lot of ways. And I remember when that withdrawal was made, I reached out, I'm a pastor, I reached out to military members in my congregation and said, hey, praying for you today. Guys who had been deployed to Afghanistan, I know this is a difficult time. They were devastated at the way this was handled. And you know that, and you talk about that. There's so many people. So at that point, you are still, though, you're in the military. Tell us where you are when the Afghanistan withdrawal is going down.
So, I mean, in the world we live in now, we're all connected by technology. I'm watching these decisions real time. So I see when they make the decision to pull all the military troops out. I see that we haven't evacuated American citizens. I see when we leave Bagram Air Base, and I'm furious. And so the day 26 August, when the Marines, 13 Marines were killed with a suicide vest attack, I was so frustrated, I wrote my frustrations out on a computer on a Word document. And then I looked at the Word document and thought, somebody needs to say these exact words. I knew no article would publish it. And if they did, it wouldn't be timely and it would be heavily edited. I knew that no senior leaders were going to say it. Not only did I know no senior leaders were going to say it, like we're talking about weaponizing the media, I knew that they not only wouldn't hold themselves accountable, but they would try and spin it as a success somehow, which they did. And so I just decided that service members needed timely, accurate assessment of failure. And that would validate their sacrifices more than all the go seek a therapist wave of a hand. And so I was a battalion commander at a place called Advanced Infantry Training Battalion in Camp Lejeune. And I made a video from my office in my camis, stated name and rank and uniform, and proceeded to lay out some of the mistakes they made, like abandoning Bagram and none of my military leaders pushing back. And I ended the video by saying I demanded accountability.
So you make a video saying you demand accountability. You post that video. I think you're paced outside the house. You post the video. You go inside. When do you know that it has blown up?
It only took about 30 minutes. I posted the video, and then I tried to kind of distract myself because I understood the implications of posting it. I went inside the house. I sat in front of the fish tank. Eventually 20, 30 minutes go by, and I walked upstairs and started changing for bed. And that's when my wife walked in the room and was like, "Did you post a video?" And then literally almost simultaneously, my phone started blowing up with people texting me about the video, and it just kind of snowballed from there.
All right. So then you go, and the story, you go into work the next day. Tell me how the reaction comes down. First of all, was your initial reaction from people positive, negative? What kind of reactions were you getting right off the bat?
There's a lot of fear for me as an individual. Everyone that reached out knew me personally, and they also knew the implications of what I had just done.
Yeah, you just blown up a career at that point.
Yeah, and so they were all just afraid for me, and so they were all pleading with me to take it down to save my career. And I told them all no, this was the hill I was willing to die on. So I came into my office the next morning and talked to my boss. He told me to go home and take the weekend, and while they assessed, And then something changed. He pulled me back in a couple hours later and he relieved me. So I was relieved like by lunchtime.
And so that is the equivalent of being fired, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so you've been relieved of command. Not a good place to be. You go, we're not going to probably have time to go through all the difficulties, but that you faced after that. I am interested, maybe we should, so people understand. This came at a cost for you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you put in 17 years into a military career. Were you given an opportunity? You lost that career. I'm assuming that means pensions, all those things that go along with that. I would say lost. Maybe you would say invested. Maybe someone else would say wasted. I don't know. But when that time comes and you decide that I'm going to make this video, you put it out there, was there ever an opportunity after the video went out to recant, to salvage? Did they give you a chance to back off?
Yes. So when I was fired, I knew my continued advancement in the military was over. But there was still a high probability I would make it to retirement. And so the choice I had after that first video, I was told they were going to move me from Camp Lejeune to Quantico, where I would sit in a cubicle next to the general officer while I awaited further legal action for posting that video. I would most likely have to, this is my words now, this is me just as I was thinking through it. So that's all I was really told. But what I knew was going to happen is I would go up there, I would have to apologize, I would have to back away from my statement, and I would probably have some type of mental health thing projected on me. Like, we know you probably got some PTSD. I know you don't think you do, but you probably do, right? I mean, admit that you do, and you can go get some help, right? And so I could have done that. I could have apologized. I could have said, yeah, I'm a hurting veteran. I got problems. And then they would have slapped my hand, and I could have worked PowerPoint slides in a cubicle for the next 3 years till my retirement. That was the choice. Or since they hadn't addressed any of the content of my statements, I say, no, I agree with what I said. I'm not apologizing, and I'm going to continue to make statements until you address, and I'm going to apply pressure on you. That was the choice. And I just decided I wasn't going to live my life apologizing for something that I felt very strongly about.
So at some point, somebody needs to go back and find that captain when you started this whole story that told you Marine officers don't retreat, and they need to blame him for everything after your first action.
I mean, I got to tell you, Pat, part of me was surprised. Like, once I started making follow-on statements and they kept continuing to try and bully and silence me, like who did they made me? Like, yeah. They thought I was just going to curl up and quit. Like, they should know better than anyone who I am and what I'm capable of. And it was shocking to me that they just assumed that I would curl up and say, I'm sorry.
Yeah, literally, that's the only story that goes through my mind as you're saying this. Well, I've got these two choices, and I've already been trained that we don't retreat. So here we go, up the hill, into the pillbox we go. And so, so talking about that, they gave you a chance to recant. What can you share with the audience, just maybe an overview? What did this decision cost you?
Well, once I made the second video, I was basically announcing my retirement, and I was angry and I was emotional. I was giving up my whole life at that point. And once I did that, everything kind of, that's where it went off. The train went off the tracks. So my wife asked me to leave. My bosses wouldn't accept my resignation because they knew I was going to be going to court martial, but they couldn't. Nothing happens fast in the military, and so because they couldn't get their act together to do an investigation or put stuff together, I just kept making statements, and then I was outpacing the legal process, and then that's when they started to panic. They tried to put me under a gag order. I continued to make statements, and so eventually they just put me in solitary confinement.
So you actually were physically locked up at this point.
I was locked up physically in a solitary cell for 9 days.
How long did you spend locked up total?
9 days.
Just the 9 days. And so, and the idea is we can't control this guy, so we'll lock him down. And so coming out of that, that's marriage, that's career, that's obviously financial security. That's friendships, relationships. I'm sure there's people who you had hoped would come down a different spot than they did throughout this whole process. So I'll go back and ask the question it's probably the easiest question. It's probably the most lame question you're going to get, but I think I asked a few good ones that'll make up for this one. Why you? Like, why not just sit there and just get to retirement? Why? What are you going to change by speaking up? What made you the guy? Why you? Why now? Why then? Why the follow-up? Why?
I didn't go into it trying to be like the guy. I just went into it knowing there was no other guy. So it was like, if not me, then who? I mean, if not now, then when? It seemed like an important time in American history where we needed a leader. I happened to have enough street cred, for lack of a better term. Like, I had been there and done that. Got a master's in military science. I understood how the process worked, and I knew it was wrong. And if everyone just looks over their shoulder and says, who's it going to be? It's not going to be me. We're destined to fail and keep repeating the same mistakes. And sometimes it only takes one person to be brave enough to stand up, where other people start getting the comfortability of, yeah, he's right. And then they start standing up. And then that's when change really happens. So, I didn't do it to make myself a martyr. I did it because I thought it was the right thing to do.
So now what? What's life look like, a year in?
Well, I got out on Christmas Eve and I did a bunch of media for a couple months. So that took me to like March. In March, I wrote the book. That took me to like the end of April, and it came out the first week of September. I took May, June, and July to get my life in order. I still had stuff in personal storage. I didn't have a doctor, didn't have a dentist, like all that stuff. And then in August, I started promoting the book and was back in the media. And I've moved on to book signings. I'm booked out all the way until really Christmas. And then in January 23, I will reassess and figure out what I want to be when I grow up.
Now, yeah, time to think about that now, right? And so there was some talk. You talked about doing a lot of media and that sort of thing. About you went out and you made this statement in uniform. It became political. Did you intend for it to be political? Was it intended to go after one side or the other? No,
I appreciate that question. I never once mentioned the word president or Joe Biden ever. And every headline was Lieutenant Colonel Scheller criticizes Joe Biden's botched Afghanistan withdrawal. Said everybody. I mean, I never said that. If we can't hold senior military leaders accountable and have that be an apolitical issue, I don't know what apolitical issues we have left. I mean, you talked about how the military should be one of the last institutions that we can all trust. And I think trust is a two-way street. When you fail, we should trust that you're held accountable. But it's almost impossible to make a statement that indicts the whole system of government and not have it just instantly turned hyper-political. And that was one of the things that was very hard to navigate.
So are the generals more powerful than the president?
Well, I'll tell you what, Congress has demonstrated they're incapable of holding the generals accountable. So I would submit that the generals are more important, or I guess they have more ability to defend themselves than Congress members. It's crazy. So not one Congress member can do anything to them. Now, the president can always hold them accountable, but he'll fire them for everything but warfighting capability. Think about it. I mean, General McChrystal, that's about like a Rolling Stone article. Generals aren't fired for warfighting capability, because if they were to be fired for warfighting capability, that would be an indictment on the commander-in-chief's warfighting ability. So they're never fired for losing a war. And so, there is no third branch of government, judicial, because the judicial portion in the military is governed by the same commanders that are demonstrating the inability to govern themselves. And so we're left with who is going to hold them accountable.
Now, I don't have a master's in military science, so I will put that caveat out there before we go down this path. But I do like to read a lot of war-based history. And it seems to me it's interesting that you just said that we don't fire generals for warfighting capability. There was a time when that was one of the only things that would get a general fired. Yeah. Whether it be guys with morality issues, alcoholics, criticizing the president. You see I know, again, I'm not going to teach you any history, but, in my mind, I'm just going through even, Lincoln's trouble with finding the right guy at the right time, and McClellan being loved by the men but not being willing to engage, and all those things, and it's interesting that when we stopped firing guys for not performing, we stopped performing. I guess that
Lincoln is a great example of a commander in chief with no military experience that was willing and smart enough. I mean, Lincoln begrudgingly came to the conclusion that the generals didn't know more than him, right? Like, he wanted to go into it thinking that he was going to allow the military professionals to run the military, but he was wise enough and strong enough in his own leadership and his beliefs to say, no, McClellan, you're not doing well. Like, I mean, he fired like 3 or 4 guys before he got to Grant, and Grant wasn't even a good tactician. Yeah. Grant just had the ability to stick with it and use his greater strength in numbers to just continue to apply pressure on Lee. And I will say, after World War I, we had a Secretary of the Army called Marshall, and he came in and he fired just a ton of general officers, which allowed the ascension of people like Eisenhower. And so you were able to actually get talent up much quicker, which led to our victory in World War II. Like, what we need is another Marshall to come in and clean up the bureaucratic, people-pleasing general class that we have now.
That's interesting. And going back to that, yeah, because you could see kind of a reshaping of the military there between 1 and 2, for sure. Absolutely. That's a good point. Now, who is responsible? When you look at Afghanistan, you look at that botched withdrawal, where do we put the responsibility?
Well, I think the buck always stops with the president of the United States. So I wouldn't say it as a sitting active duty military uniformed member. So if I'm the president, I'm never going to blame a previous president. Bottom line, all we have, like, it doesn't matter what party's in charge, we blame the last party. And that's not leadership. That's a politician. I want a leader. But my big pitch has been the American people has to get smart on the breakdowns at the operational and strategic level, which we explained earlier, which is the 4-star general officer level. No one is holding them accountable, and they have to be held accountable. And so for this debacle, my opinion, Joe Biden, he's just not a very strong leader. So he had a bad idea. The responsibility, the reason we have military professionals is to catch bad ideas like this. So General McKenzie, the theater commander, had an obligation to say, no, President Biden, that doesn't make sense for all the reasons we talked about. Like, these are just fundamentally a flawed plan. And I can't execute this without great risk to the force or to the mission. And if you are going to go forward with this, I'm going to publicly resign and take my concerns to the people. This has happened before. After World War II, when Carter was president, he tried to pull all the American forces out of Korea. There was a general named Singlab that did exactly what I just described. Went to Carter privately and was like, if you do that, we pull the Americans, the North and South Korea is going to go to war together. We're going to lose all the progress. All the sacrifices service members gave into the Korean War will be null and void. Carter said, I heard you out. I'm still going to do it. And then Singlab went public, and he was able to change the decision of Carter by doing that. But Singlab was a World War II vet. He was a different type of general, and we just don't have generals with moral courage like that anymore.
Do you think that lack of moral courage comes from generals who maybe rose up through the military ranks in a time when they didn't go through the crucible of the level of combat that many of our generals in the past did? By the time you get, for example, by the time you get to the Civil War, everybody's just fought in the Spanish, or the Mexican. They've been down to Mexico fighting. Guys on both sides been fighting together. When you get to World War II, you had guys that come through combat, been moved up. Is that kind of the problem? Maybe just the lack of experience at that level?
I think so, 100%. I actually don't go into that in my book, but let's use Matt as someone who I think has just built a public persona. But if you actually look at the facts of what he's accomplished, it's been very little. And that guy didn't see combat until he was a colonel. I mean, that's the bottom line, until the push through Iraq. And so there's a great example of a general of our time that people have lionized, but it's like, he didn't have any combat experience. I know he got the Desert Shield, Desert Storm, but he wasn't killing anyone. He was there, right? That's not what my generation went through with 8, 9, 10 deployments back to the same combat zones. Yeah, and it's not the same as the World War II guys, right? That's like, talk about a great generation. That's why Singlabs were able to have the moral courage to say, no, this doesn't make sense.
And it's interesting, I mentioned jokingly earlier, Chesty Puller talking about charging that hill, most decorated Marine ever, and you look at him and you see his career at the end, that you could almost see that fear. And I guess you go back, we talk about that with Patton, talk about with a lot of people that, there's a particular type of leader that we need that we don't necessarily want, it would seem. That being said, you've kind of laid it out pretty completely. And, I want folks to not have too much of the story. I want them to go get a copy of Crisis of Command. I do want to ask this, and I think this will be the last question, then we'll find out where folks can keep up with you at. So maybe you haven't thought about it. Maybe you had. You're a bright guy. That's obvious. I think all of us have these moments where we philosophize, I guess, and maybe we go too deep. Maybe we shouldn't. So how's history going to remember you? You're going to be remembered, I would imagine. And history's written a lot differently than it used to be. And so that may weigh into that somewhat. But how will you be remembered? And how do you want to be remembered? And you might think that's too big of a question. So before you answer it, to say, how do you want to be remembered? But I think you've earned the right to at least say how you'd like to be remembered.
I think history favorably remembers a champion, and my story is not yet finished.
Good answer. Good answer. So let me ask you this. How do we follow you? Your story's not yet finished. Are you going to write this? And then you said you don't know what you're going to do when you grow up, but there's got to be something else out there. And I know you're not trying, you didn't make that plan to try to segue into another career, the worst segue ever, if you did. But what is your plan moving forward? What can we expect next, maybe? And then how can folks follow you in that journey?
Right now, for public consumption, is that I'm promoting the book for the next 6 months, and then I'm going to reevaluate in January. But, I've obviously thought longer and deeper than that.
Sure.
So we'll see what leads. I'm going to reassess. And to your point, yeah, I did not have a deep plan when I made that first video. A lot of what I do is what's the best thing for the next 3 to 6 months with a potential of a longer plan, but you always got to be able to adapt based on the situation on the ground, always update the plan, right? So people can follow my journey. I've got a website. It's called AuthenticAmericans.com. At the website, you can see my schedule for my book signings. All my social media is tied to the bottom of it. I'm basically just on 4 platforms: Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. They're all at Stuart Scheller. I post a lot. I usually post like once or twice a week. And that's where you can find me. The book Crisis of Command is sold mostly through Amazon, but it's in all the stores. So like if you go to Target.com, Walmart.com, it's in Barnes & Noble, Books A Million. So really anywhere you buy books, you can find it. It's doing really well. It was number 6 on the AP top 10 seller. It was number 7 in the Wall Street Journal this past week. So it did really well first week out. I think a lot of people are resonating with it. So I hope Crisis of Command, you check it out.
Absolutely, guys. Go get a copy of Crisis of Command and follow Stu Scheller on all of those platforms. I do think that there will be a lot you can learn. You'll find that he will wax eloquent about a variety of different points and different ideas. And I think there'll be something there that you can learn. Oh, I guess the last thing, I will have to throw in one more last, and that is public office. Is that out there in the future?
We'll see.
There you go. I got to ask that question. All right. Thank you, Stu. Thank you so much for joining me today. And to everyone else, I hope that today has been more than a conversation for you.
Thanks again for being part of More Than a Conversation today. If you'd like more content like this, check out my blog at www.pastorconley.com. That's PastorConley.com. Again, that's PastorConley.com. I'd also love to see you join us in worship at Garden Sanctuary. If you're ever in Rock Hill, South Carolina, or the greater Charlotte area, we'd love to have you stop by and worship with us. Check us out at www.gardensanctuary.org. That's gardensanctuary.org. Until next time, I hope this has been more than a conversation.